The night this all began, I thought I was just doing a small kindness. Nothing heroic, nothing worth remembering. I was standing in line at the grocery store while a winter storm pressed its face against the windows, the kind of storm that makes the whole world feel smaller and quieter. Snow was falling thick and heavy, the kind that doesn't stop, the kind that buries things. In front of me stood an elderly woman, bent slightly forward, wrapped in a thin, faded shawl that looked like it had seen too many winters. She emptied a handful of loose coins onto the counter, counting them slowly, carefully, as if each one mattered more than it should. Bread, milk, a few potatoes, an onion. That was all. When the cashier told her she was short, the woman looked confused, almost hurt, like the numbers had betrayed her. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped forward and paid the rest. It wasn't much, just a few dollars. She thanked me, but before she left, she leaned in close and whispered something I would never forget. "When your husband leaves," she said softly, "don't touch the snow in your yard. Do you hear me? Leave it, all of it, until morning." I almost laughed. It sounded like nonsense, like something an old woman might say out of loneliness or superstition. But the way she looked at me, steady and serious, sent a chill through me, deeper than the cold outside. I nodded, more to end the moment than because I believed her. The next morning, I would learn that if I had ignored those words, I would have lost my home, my safety, and the truth about my marriage forever. I was 58 years old then, married for over 3 decades, living what most people would call a quiet, settled life. My husband, Vernon, had been a truck driver for years, always on the road, always tired, always distant, in a way that crept in so slowly I barely noticed when warmth turned into routine and routine into silence. We lived on the edge of town in a house that had been in my family long before him. I knew every creak of the floors, every draft near the windows, every flower bed in the yard. It was my anchor, my proof that I belonged somewhere. That afternoon, after leaving the store, I told myself the woman's words meant nothing. Snow was snow, winter was winter, and husbands leaving for work trips was just part of my life. Vernon had already complained that the driveway needed to be cleared before he left that evening. It was a normal request, an ordinary night, nothing out of place. And yet, as I rode the bus home through the white blur of falling snow, her voice kept returning to me, calm but urgent, as if she had seen something I couldn't. I had no idea then that this ordinary evening, this simple choice to listen or not listen, was standing between the life I thought I had and the truth waiting quietly outside my door. She stood there so small that people barely seemed to notice her, as if hardship had slowly taught her to take up less space in the world. Her coat was too thin for the weather, the sleeves shiny at the elbows from years of wear. The shawl around her shoulders had once been a bright color, but now it looked washed out, tired, like it had lived a long life alongside her. When she opened her wallet, it wasn't really a wallet at all, just a soft, cracked piece of leather held together by habit. Coins spilled into her palm, and she counted them slowly, lips moving without sound. Each coin was placed back on the counter with care, as if she was afraid they might disappear if she moved too fast. I noticed her hands then, red from the cold, swollen knuckles, fingers that had worked hard for many years and were still working, even when they shouldn't have had to. The groceries on the belt were painfully modest. No extras, no comfort food, just enough to get through another day. When the cashier told her she was short, the woman frowned and counted again, her shoulders drooping a little more with every number. It wasn't embarrassment I saw on her face, it was confusion, as if she truly believed she had done everything right and the world had come up short. People behind me shifted impatiently. Someone sighed loudly. I felt that familiar pressure to stay quiet, to mind my own business, to let the moment pass. I had done that so many times before, but something about her, maybe the way she stood there refusing to crumble, made my chest ache.
I stepped forward before I could talk myself out of it and placed a bill on the counter. I didn't think, I didn't calculate, I just did it. She turned toward me, startled, her eyes widening. "Oh no, dear," she said quickly. "I can put something back. I don't want to trouble anyone." "It's fine," I told her, keeping my voice light. "Really, please don't worry." She hesitated, then nodded slowly, as if accepting something much bigger than a few dollars. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to." I smiled and shrugged, already reaching for my own groceries. I didn't want praise, I didn't want gratitude, I just wanted the moment to stay simple. But when I looked back at her, my breath caught. Her eyes were wrong. Not in a frightening way, but in a way I couldn't explain. They were clear and sharp, far too alert for a woman who looked so worn down by life. Those eyes didn't wander, they didn't blink too much. They focused straight on me, steady and heavy, as if she was measuring something inside me I didn't even know was there. I felt exposed under that gaze, like she could see every compromise I had ever made, every quiet disappointment I had swallowed. She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her. Soap, old fabric, something herbal, almost medicinal. Her fingers wrapped around my arm, thin but surprisingly strong. I flinched a little, not from pain, but from the intensity of it. "Listen to me," she said softly. There was no trembling in her voice now, no weakness, just urgency. "When your husband leaves," she whispered, leaning in so only I could hear, "don't touch the snow in your yard, do you hear me? Leave it, all of it, until morning." I stared at her, confused, half expecting her to smile and tell me she was joking. She didn't. Her grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to make it clear she meant every word. "It's important," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Very important. Promise me." My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have said why. The store noise seemed to fade around us. The beeping scanners, the murmurs of other customers, all of it felt distant. Okay, I said finally, more to calm her than anything else. "I promise." Only then did she relax. Her hand slipped from my arm and she nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if sealing something unseen between us. For a brief moment, something like relief crossed her face. "Good," she said. "You did a good thing today. Remember that." She gathered her bag and turned away, moving faster than I expected. By the time I finished paying and looked toward the doors, she was already pushing them open, her small figure swallowed by the white chaos outside. Snow rushed in with her, loud and wild. Then the doors closed and she was gone. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the glass, half expecting her to turn back, to wave, to explain herself. She didn't. The storm erased her almost instantly, as if she had never been there at all. As I stepped outside a few minutes later, the wind slapped my face hard, and snow clung to my eyelashes. I pulled my scarf tighter and shook my head, trying to laugh it off. Just an old woman, I told myself, lonely, maybe a little confused. People say strange things when they don't have much else left. But even as I said it, I knew something about that explanation didn't sit right. And all the way home, through the swirling snow and the dim streetlights, her voice kept returning to me, calm but urgent, as if she had seen something I couldn't. I had no idea then that this ordinary evening, this simple choice to listen or not listen, was standing between the life I thought I had and the truth waiting quietly outside my door. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself the whole thing at the store was nothing more than a strange encounter I would forget by morning. The house looked the same as it always did. Dark windows, snow piled high along the fence, the porch light flickering slightly in the wind. I stepped inside, stamped the snow from my boots, and let the familiar quiet settle around me. This house had been my world for so long that I could move through it without thinking, turning up the heat, setting the kettle on, putting groceries away in their usual places. Everything felt steady, predictable, safe. That was how my life had been for years. Not exciting, not joyful exactly, but stable. My husband, Vernon, had been on the road most of our marriage, hauling freight across states, gone more often than home. People used to say I was strong for managing alone so much. I never corrected them. The truth was, I had simply gotten used to being by myself, even when he was technically there. Vernon came home that evening just before dark, bringing the cold in with him like he always did. He shook snow from his jacket onto the floor without noticing, or maybe without caring, and went straight to the kitchen. There was no kiss, no question about my day, just the heavy sound of his boots and the familiar weight of his presence filling the room. He was a big man, solid, worn down by years of hard work, his face permanently set in a serious line. We used to talk once, about everything and nothing, about the road, about plans, about dreams. Somewhere along the way, those conversations disappeared, replaced by silence and short instructions. He glanced out the window and frowned. "That snow's getting bad," he said. "The driveway needs to be cleared tonight." I nodded automatically, the way I always did. It wasn't a request. It never was. He was leaving early in the morning for another long trip, and he wanted the path clear, the truck able to pull out without trouble. That was my job. It had always been my job, keeping things running smoothly while he came and went. "I'll get to it," I said, though my legs already felt tired and my back ached from the day. He grunted, satisfied, and started packing his bag, moving through the house like a guest who knew where everything was but didn't linger. I watched him from the doorway, noticing things I had ignored for years. How he didn't look at me when he spoke, how his voice carried no warmth, only habit, how being married had somehow turned into coexisting under the same roof. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, snowflakes slamming against the glass in thick sheets. I cooked dinner out of routine, not appetite, and we ate mostly in silence. When he finished, he stood, zipped his jacket, and slung his bag over his shoulder. "I'm heading out," he said. "Don't forget the snow. If it drifts overnight, it'll be worse in the morning." "I know," I replied. He nodded once and walked out, the door closing behind him with a dull, final sound. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to his truck fade into the storm. The house felt larger without him, emptier in a way that was hard to explain. I told myself that was normal. I had spent half my life waving him off like this. I moved to the window and looked out into the yard. The snow was deep already, smooth and untouched, glowing faintly under the streetlight. The shovel leaned against the porch wall where it always did, waiting. I could picture myself bundling up, dragging it through the drifts, clearing a path that would probably be covered again by morning. That was the sensible thing to do, the expected thing. And yet, as I stood there, the old woman's voice drifted back into my thoughts, quiet but firm. "When your husband leaves, don't touch the snow." I shook my head, almost annoyed with myself. How could a stranger's words carry more weight than years of routine? It made no sense. Still, my hand didn't reach for my coat. My feet didn't move toward the door. Something inside me hesitated, a small, unfamiliar resistance. I told myself I was just tired. The day had been long, the storm was fierce, there was no harm in waiting until morning. Snow fell every winter, husbands left for work, life went on. I turned away from the window, leaving the snow exactly as it was, smooth and silent, unaware that this small act of disobedience was the first choice I had made for myself in a very long time. That night, sleep came in broken pieces. I would drift off for a few minutes, then jolt awake, my heart racing for no clear reason. The wind howled around the house, pressing against the walls as if trying to get inside, and every creak of the old wood sounded louder than it ever had. I told myself I was being foolish, letting a stranger's words get into my head, but my body didn't seem to believe that. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the snow outside, smooth and perfect, like a blank page waiting to be marked. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, listening to the clock tick, counting the seconds until morning. Sometime after midnight, I slipped into a dream that felt too real to ignore. I was standing at the front window, staring out into the yard, and the snow was falling straight down, silent and heavy. The old woman from the store stood at the edge of the driveway, her thin coat whipping in the wind. She didn't look cold, she didn't look weak, she looked afraid. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharp and urgent, just like before. She lifted her hand and pointed at the ground, her mouth moving without sound at first. Then the words came through clear as if she were standing beside my bed. "Don't touch it. Leave it, please." I tried to answer her, to tell her that I understood, but my voice wouldn't work. The snow began to glow faintly, and I woke with a sharp intake of breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. The house was completely still, too still. I sat up and listened, straining for any sound that didn't belong. No footsteps, no voices, just the distant wind and the hum of the heater. I checked the time, just before 4 in the morning. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood there for a moment, debating whether I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was just a bad dream. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was years of swallowing unease finally finding a voice. Still, I found myself walking down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the floor. I paused at the front door, resting my hand against the wood, feeling the vibration of the wind on the other side. The urge to open it was strong, almost irrational. I wanted to see the snow, to confirm it was still there, untouched. I wanted reassurance. But I didn't open the door. I remembered her grip on my arm, the firmness in her voice, the fear she hadn't tried to hide. I stepped back, pressing my hand to my chest instead, and took a slow breath. Eventually, exhaustion won. I went to bed, though sleep never fully did. When morning finally came, it arrived pale and quiet, the storm having moved on sometime before dawn. Light filtered through the curtains, and the world felt oddly calm, as if nothing bad could possibly exist in it. I got up slowly, my body stiff, my mind still fogged by broken rest. The first thing I did was go to the front window. The yard lay before me, white and still, exactly as it had been the night before. The driveway was completely covered, no shovel marks, no cleared path, just smooth snow stretching from the porch to the street. I felt a strange sense of relief, like I had passed a small test without knowing what it was. Then my eyes adjusted. There, cutting through the untouched white, were footprints. Deep, heavy, deliberate. They came from the street, crossed the driveway, and moved slowly toward the side of the house. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the glass, my heart beginning to race again.
For a long moment, I couldn't move at all. I stood frozen at the window, my breath fogging the glass as I traced the shape of the footprints with my eyes. They weren't scattered or careless the way footprints usually are after a storm. These were deep and steady, spaced evenly, as if whoever made them had walked slowly, confidently, knowing exactly where they were going. They cut straight across the driveway I hadn't cleared, the very snow I had been told not to touch. My stomach tightened as the meaning settled in. Someone had been there while I was alone in the house. I pulled the curtain back further, my hands trembling now. The footprints didn't stop at the driveway. They curved around the side of the house, disappearing toward the back where my bedroom window faced the yard. I followed their path, my heart pounding louder with every step they took in my imagined replay. I thought of the night, the broken sleep, the dream, the way the house had felt too quiet. A cold realization slid through me. This hadn't been a dream. Something had happened while I lay in my bed, unaware. I forced myself to step away from the window and grab my robe, wrapping it tight around me like it could offer protection. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, each room holding shadows I had never noticed before. I checked the locks, one by one.
Front door, back door, windows. Everything was still secure. No broken glass, no forced entry. That almost made it worse. Whoever had come hadn't needed to get inside to do what they were there to do. I returned to the window, my legs weak, and scanned the snow again. The footprints were large. A man's boots, without question. The tread was deep and sharp, the kind you see on work boots, not something light or casual. I tried to tell myself it could have been a neighbor, someone lost, someone checking on something innocent. But the path didn't fit that story. It wasn't wandering, it was purposeful. Fear crept in slowly, then all at once. My chest felt tight, my palms damp. I thought of Vernon leaving the night before, his insistence that the driveway be cleared, his timing. The thought made me feel foolish, even guilty, for letting my mind go there. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease twisting inside me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what I was seeing. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and wait. I watched from the window as the morning light grew brighter, the footprints standing out more clearly against the white snow, impossible to deny. Each minute felt like an hour. When the officer arrived, his tires crunching softly at the edge of the road, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. He walked the path carefully, crouching to examine the prints, his expression serious. He asked questions I struggled to answer. Did I hear anything? Did I see anyone? Was I expecting a visitor? I shook my head to all of them. "These aren't random," he said finally, standing up and brushing snow from his gloves. "Whoever this was, they knew this house." That sentence settled deep in my bones, heavier than the fear itself. As the officer continued his work, I looked back at the untouched snow and understood something with terrifying clarity. If I had gone out there the night before, if I had shoveled the driveway like I was told, these footprints would have been erased. The only sign that someone had come and gone would have disappeared by morning, and I would never have known how close I had come to something far worse. The officer stayed longer than I expected, moving slowly, taking photographs, measuring the depth and spacing of the prints like each detail mattered. He didn't rush, and somehow that made the fear settle in deeper. Men who aren't worried don't take that much care. He followed the trail all the way around the house, stopping beneath my bedroom window, then along the side yard where the fence met the trees. The footprints paused there, as if whoever made them had stood still for a while, watching. My skin prickled at the thought of someone standing so close while I slept. "Did anyone come by last night?" he asked. No one." He nodded, writing something down. "These boots are heavy, work boots, size 11 or 12, I'd say, not someone just out for a stroll." I wrapped my arms around me and nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. He asked about my husband next, where he worked, when he left, whether he was expected back. The questions felt routine, but I sensed something careful in the way he asked them, as if he were testing the shape of the story, seeing where it might bend. Before he left, he asked about neighbors with cameras. I hadn't even thought about that. Across the street, Mrs. Coleman had installed one after a break-in last year. The officer knocked on her door while I waited inside, my nerves stretched thin. When he returned, he told me they would review the footage and get back to me. Hours passed with no word. I tried to distract myself, cleaning a kitchen that was already clean, making tea I forgot to drink. Every sound outside made me jump. When the phone finally rang, my heart lurched so hard I nearly dropped it. They had something. The footage showed a man arriving late at night, his car parking just far enough down the street to stay out of direct view. He walked calmly up the driveway, flashlight in hand, and disappeared around the side of the house. He stayed for several minutes, then he left the same way he came, unhurried, as if there was no risk of being seen. "What kind of car?" I asked. The officer hesitated. "White sedan, company logo on the door, real estate related." The words didn't make sense at first. Real estate? Why would a real estate worker be at my house in the middle of the night? I felt dizzy, like the ground had shifted under my feet. Later that afternoon, I drove myself to the real estate office whose logo matched the footage. My hands shook on the steering wheel, but I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, a mistake, a wrong address, something harmless. Inside, the office smelled like fresh coffee and printer ink. Smiling faces on framed posters promised easy sales and happy endings. When I asked about an appraisal order for my address, the receptionist tapped at her computer, then looked up at me with polite confusion. She said, "Yes, we have that. It was requested last week." My chest tightened. By who? She read the name aloud. My husband's. The room felt suddenly too small, too bright. I asked to see the paperwork, my voice steady only because shock had taken over. There it was, my address, my home, my signature clumsily forged at the bottom of the page. I walked out without saying another word, the truth crashing down around me in heavy pieces. The man in the snow hadn't been a threat in the way I first imagined. He had been there to measure, to assess, to prepare, to take something from me without my knowledge. And the only reason I knew any of it was because the snow had been left untouched.
The moment I saw that forged signature, something inside me broke. My husband, the man I had trusted for decades, had been planning behind my back. I drove home in a daze, the engine ticking over as if it knew my panic, my disbelief. The house felt different when I stepped inside. Too quiet, too sharp, like it was holding its breath for what was coming next. Every photo, every little object suddenly felt like a lie I had been living in. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork over and over. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. How long had he been doing this? Who else knew, and why? The questions swirled around me, a storm I couldn't calm. Then I remembered the old woman at the register, her eyes sharp, her warning urgent. Was she seeing the same betrayal I was? Had she somehow known? By evening, he walked in like nothing had changed. His coat hung loosely on his frame, the smell of his cologne faint but familiar. "Dinner's ready," he said casually. I looked at him across the table, the papers laid out like evidence of a crime I hadn't fully grasped yet. He noticed them. "What's that?" he asked. His tone was careful, polite, but there was an edge there, the kind of edge you hear when someone is cornered. I slid the papers toward him without saying a word. His eyes flicked over the forged signature, the dates, the order requests. For the first time in years, I saw fear cross his face. You've been planning this?" I asked, voice low but firm. He opened his mouth, closed it again. "It's not what it looks like," he said finally. But I had heard that line before, in smaller lies, in whispered excuses. "It looks exactly like what it is," I said. My anger was hot, but beneath it was a chill, the cold understanding that the man I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the rooms, tracing my fingers over the furniture, remembering conversations, moments, laughter that now felt hollow. Outside, the snow had started falling again, covering the ground in pristine white, a cruel contrast to the mess inside my home, inside my life. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal, it was intimate. Every decision he had made, every secret plan had been a wedge driven between us, and now I knew I would have to face it head on, alone. The next morning, the cold light of dawn felt sharper than usual. I stood by the window, watching the untouched snow that stretched across the yard, glistening like a warning I could almost hear. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, "Do not touch the snow." If I had shoveled it, I might never have seen the tracks, never known the depth of Vernon's betrayal. My heart still pounded from the night's realization, but there was no time to linger in despair. I had to act. I called Officer Purnell as soon as the precinct opened. His calm, familiar voice on the line gave me a small measure of steadiness.
I explained everything: the forged power of attorney, the appraisal, the strange nighttime visit, and the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. He instructed me to stay put while he began gathering evidence and tracking the agency's records. The snow outside was melting slightly under the weak sun, revealing faint outlines of what had happened the night before, traces that might otherwise have been lost. As I waited, I went through Vernon's study, a room I had rarely entered except to file bills or glance at his travel logs. Papers were stacked neatly, as always, but something felt off. I sifted through the files, noticing a folder tucked under a stack labeled Business Matters, not his usual meticulous labeling. Inside were emails, printouts, and handwritten notes that didn't match the timelines he had given me. There were references to buyers, agreements, and a network of contacts I had never known existed. Whoever he was working with had experience, precision, and a plan. By mid-morning, Gareth arrived. His presence was steadying, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this. Together, we retraced the steps the mysterious appraiser had taken, noting every detail captured on Mrs. Higgins' security footage. The car, the methodical pacing around the house, the calm closure of the gate. It was all unnervingly deliberate. Gareth's sharp eyes caught the smallest details: the tread pattern in the snow, the subtle differences in the approach to each window. He murmured that the person was likely casing the house for something more than an appraisal, something bigger, something premeditated. Then came the breakthrough. Gareth received a call from the agency director confirming that the appraisal had been requested under my husband's name. But one thing didn't add up. The request came late in the evening, yet the paperwork showed it had been processed as if it were a routine daytime order. That meant someone had manipulated the timing to make sure I was alone, that the house would be empty, and that no one would notice until it was too late. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't just a deception, it was a careful, calculated betrayal designed to leave me powerless. I felt a wave of nausea and disbelief. The man I'd shared decades with, laughed with, cooked for, worried over, had orchestrated this in secret. The old woman's warning, her piercing eyes, and the urgency in her voice weren't coincidence. They were a lifeline I had barely noticed until now. If I hadn't listened, if I had shoveled that snow like Vernon demanded, the evidence would have been erased and I would have been blindsided completely. Sitting back in my chair, I realized something else. The betrayal might involve more than just him. The notes, the emails, the meticulous instructions to the appraiser suggested that someone else had helped him plan this. Who could have known the ins and outs of my house, my routines, my every step? And now why? My mind raced with possibilities, each more chilling than the last. Gareth leaned closer, his voice firm but measured. "We're going to uncover everything, Mrs. Vance. Whoever's involved, we'll find them. But we need to move fast. If they've planned this, they won't wait around." I nodded, wrapping my hands around a cup of tea I hadn't even tasted. The warmth didn't reach my fingers, but it steadied my resolve. I would not be a victim. I would fight for the home, for the life I had built, for the truth.
That afternoon, I returned to the local library, the one Vernon had insisted was just for quiet afternoons, to search through public records and property transactions. My hands shook slightly as I flipped through pages of deeds, tax filings, and prior appraisals, but there was a method to the madness. Somewhere in this mountain of paperwork, I had to find the link, something, anything, that would tell me who else had been quietly aiding Vernon. Hours passed, the late winter sun slanting low across the dusty tables, and then I found it. A small notation in Vernon's handwriting on a scanned appraisal request, an address I didn't recognize, scribbled hastily, almost hidden. My pulse quickened. I cross-referenced it with property records and discovered it belonged to a man named Carl Merton, a local real estate consultant I had never met, though he was known in town for working with high-end estates. What unsettled me wasn't just that he existed, it was the precision of his involvement.
The dates matched the timeline of Vernon's sudden insistence that I sign papers and the mysterious nighttime visits. I felt a pang of anger, but also fear. If Vernon had confided in Carl, then this wasn't just a family betrayal, it was a professional conspiracy, calculated and deliberate. I could almost see them sitting together, plotting, confident that no one would notice the signs until it was too late. My hands tightened around the folder. I would not let that happen. That evening, I decided to take a cautious step. I called Carl, pretending to inquire about a distant property investment I might be interested in. His voice was polite, even friendly, but I noticed an undercurrent of hesitation, a pause too long before he answered some of my questions. I could feel him measuring me, testing my knowledge, weighing how much I suspected. When I mentioned Vernon casually, his tone shifted just slightly, subtle but enough to make my skin prickle. He was hiding something. I hung up, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew then that uncovering Carl's involvement wouldn't be easy. He was clever, careful, and probably used to people like me who never looked beyond surface appearances. But I had something they didn't: instinct, persistence, and the eerie warning of a woman at the register who had seemed to know more than anyone had any right to. Her words, whispered in the cold, had kept me alert, and I could feel her presence guiding me even now. I spent the rest of the night reviewing every interaction Vernon had ever had with local agencies, cross-referencing names, addresses, and dates. Patterns began to emerge, small but undeniable. It was a web, intricate and dark, stretching further than I had ever imagined. And yet, with each thread I pulled, my resolve hardened. I would expose every single one of them. No more secrets, no more deception. As I prepared for the next day, I noticed something unusual on the kitchen counter: a folded envelope, unsigned, with no return address. Inside was a single note, written in neat, careful script: "Trust no one but yourself. They are watching." My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that the danger was closer than I had thought. I didn't confront Carl directly, not yet. I had learned enough by then to know that rushing in would only warn him. Instead, I did something quieter, something that felt almost invisible. I requested copies of every document tied to my property, using my own name, my own authority, standing in offices I had avoided for years because Vernon handled those things. Each clerk looked at me with mild surprise, then professionalism, handing over records that told a story I had never been meant to read. Dates overlapped, signatures repeated, appraisal notes referenced future listings that didn't officially exist yet, and threaded through all of it was Carl's name, sometimes as a consultant, sometimes as a reviewer, sometimes barely there at all, like a shadow that knew how to stay just out of sight. By the third office, my hands stopped shaking. Fear had burned itself out, replaced by something colder and steadier: understanding. That evening, I drove past Carl's office without stopping, just once, watching the lights inside, the silhouettes moving confidently, unaware that the ground beneath them was starting to crack. When I got home, I sat in the quiet and let the truth settle fully for the first time. Vernon hadn't panicked. He hadn't made a desperate mistake. He had planned this, carefully, patiently. He had counted on my silence, my routines, my obedience. He had counted on the snow being cleared. And Carl had counted on me being exactly who I had always been. I picked up the phone and left one voicemail, short and calm, requesting a formal meeting about discrepancies in my property records. No accusations, no emotion, just facts. When I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The snow was thinner now, melting in places, but the memory of those footprints felt permanent. Whatever came next would be harder. Confrontation always is, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. The morning of the meeting arrived with the same cold clarity that had haunted the past week. I dressed deliberately, choosing a dark coat, sensible shoes, and gloves that hid my trembling hands. I wasn't the woman who had walked through the blizzard uncertain and fearful anymore. I was deliberate, alert, and quietly furious. At the agency, Carl and a few of his assistants were already gathered, papers spread across the table, their calm confidence masking nothing, yet everything. I didn't speak immediately. I let them look at me, let them notice the subtle change, the quiet fire in my eyes that hadn't been there before. Then I began. I laid out every discrepancy, every forged signature, every nighttime appraisal, the hidden communications Vernon thought I'd never find. I spoke slowly, clearly, each fact landing like a cold hammer, echoing across the polished surface of the conference table. Carl tried to interject once, twice, but I held up my hand, unshakable, letting him see for the first time that I wasn't intimidated, that I wasn't just a quiet waif in the background. Vernon's name came up, tied directly to the fraudulent documents, and I didn't flinch. I told them I had contacted the police, that a formal investigation had begun, and that any further attempts to proceed without my full knowledge would be considered criminal. For a long moment, silence filled the room, the kind of silence that comes when people realize the rules have changed, that the power they assumed was theirs has quietly shifted to someone else. Then Carl sighed, leaning back, his composure cracking ever so slightly. He knew the trail of evidence was too clear, too precise, and my calm, methodical presentation left no room for excuses. Agreements were renegotiated immediately, documents were canceled. The house, my home for over 32 decades, was legally secure again. Vernon's betrayal hung over the moment like a dense fog, but I had claimed my space, my authority, my right to protect what was mine. When I finally stepped outside, the snow had melted enough to reveal the garden paths I had tended for years. The air was crisp, but it no longer carried the same fear. I walked slowly, deliberately through the yard, letting my fingers brush against the frost-dusted roses. The old woman's warning returned to me, strangely prophetic. Do not touch the snow. That quiet caution had bought me time, clarity, and ultimately victory. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of my own strength. The betrayal had been sharp, the shock cutting, but I had survived it, and I had outmaneuvered it. And somewhere in the quiet, I imagined that old woman, her small frame disappearing into the blizzard, smiling, knowing that her warning had changed everything. I returned to the house, not as the timid wife of the past, but as the woman who had claimed her life back. The tea I brewed that evening tasted sweeter than it had in years, not because of the warmth in the cup, but because of the certainty that now I was free, vigilant, and unbroken. The snow would melt, as it always does, but the lesson it left behind was permanent. Trust your instincts, notice the warnings, and never underestimate the quiet power that comes from patience, observation, and courage. And as night fell, I finally allowed myself a long, unbroken sleep, the house around me safe, the storm outside a distant echo, and the future waiting firmly in my hands.